Hello everyone. Today our video is about John Keats from 1795 till 1821. If we concentrate on John Keats, we'll find that he is a major English poet, although he suffered from tuberculosis and he died because of it of 25. Keats' poetry is romantic because of some reasons. It describes the beauty of natural world and art. He has a poetic imagination. His skill is with poetic imagery that reproduces the sensuous experience of his reader and touches the affections and his experience most of the time. Therefore, Keats' poetry shows his love of nature and art into a deep compassion for humanity. One of the English poets of 20th century described Keats when he said, "I'm certain of nothing but the holiness of the heart's affections and the truth of imagination." And at the same time, T.S. Eliot started to judge Keats when he said that something about his letters to be the most notable and the most important ever written by any English poet for their acute reflections on poetry, poets, and the imagination. So, if we like to sum up this introduction, we have three elements, 3 points. Keats died at a very young age when he was 25 because of a very bad disease that called tuberculosis, and this disease is a disease that affects the chest and the patient cough up blood. The second point that we consider Keats one of the most important romantic poets for his love of nature, his great imagination, poetic imagination, and number 3, his awareness of the reader's experience and compassion at the same time. Now we'll discuss together early life of Keats. Keats was born in North London, England. He was the eldest son of Thomas Keats, who worked at a livery stable. His mother was Frances Keats. He had 3 sons and a daughter. The daughter started to die when she was a child in infancy, and Thomas Keats died in 1804 when he was in a riding accident, so he died as a result of a riding accident. Frances Keats died in 1810 of tuberculosis, the disease that also took the lives of the 3 sons. So 3 sons from tuberculosis, and the young daughter died in infancy because of the same disease, and the father died because of the riding accident. This shows us that his life, the life of Keats, was very hard and full of pains and losses of his family. From 1803 to 1811, Keats attended school. Toward the end of his schooling, he began to read widely and even undertook a prose translation of the Aeneid from the Latin. So he started to deal with literature in a very young age when he started to undertook a prose translation of the Aeneid from the Latin. After he left school at the age of 16, Keats was apprenticed to a surgeon for 4 years. He joined faculty of medicine to be a surgeon, and for 4 years during this time his interest in poetry grew. So he started reading prose translation Aeneid from Latin, and then the second stage that he started to his interest in poetry grew. He wrote his first poems in 1814 and passed his medical and druggist examination in 1816. This is he was a poet and at the same time a surgeon, but he will not continue his studies concerning medicine. Life as a poet. In May 1816, Keats published his first poem, the sonnet O Solitude. So he deals, John Keats started to deal with poetry, and his beginning of poetry deal with the sonnet and the poem called the sonnet O Solitude. The sonnet, this is marking the beginning of his poetic career. In writing a sonnet is a 14-line poem with a strict rhyme scheme. Keats sought to take his place in the tradition established by great classical European and British epic poets. Start to deal with different British epic poets. In the sonnet O Solitude, the speaker first expresses hope, and at the same time different natural elements in this sonnet. So he showed his interest in nature in the first sonnet he wrote in poetry that called O Solitude. In another sonnet published the same year, on first looking into Champion's Homer, Keats compares reading translations poetry to awe-inspiring experience such as an astronomer discovering a new planet or explorers first seeing the Pacific Ocean. So, in the second sonnet that called on first looking in Chapman's Homer, Keats dealt with a different theme about an astronomer discovering a new planet or explorers first reading the Pacific Ocean. In Sleep and Poetry, a long poem from 1816, Keats articulates the purpose of poetry as he sees it to soothe the cares and lift the thoughts of men. So, he started writing O Solitude, and this is a sonnet form, and then start to deal with hope and express different natural elements. In the second sonnet that called on first looking into Chapman's Homer, he deals with new theme like an astronomer discovering a new planet or explorers first seeing the Pacific Ocean. In the third one, Sleep and Poetry, this is a very long poem from 1816, and he starts to show the aim of poetry, that the main aim behind poetry, that to soothe, to refine the cares and live the thoughts of men, that improve the life of man through changing or refining his cares and affecting his thoughts. Within a year of his first publications, Keats had abandoned medicine. At the same year concerning 1816, within a year of his first publications, Keats had refused to continue in the study in the field of medicine, turned exclusively to writing poetry, and entered the mainstream of contemporary English poets. This is a swift shift in his career, that he refused to continue in medicine and turned to writing poetry and entered the mainstream of contemporary English poets. So at this year, he refused medicine. He entered the mainstream of contemporary poets, concentrates on writing poetry. He knew two important persons, Huntley, the editor and the poet of Literary magazine that published his own poetry, and the second one is the romantic poet Shelley. Endymion, this is an important poem written between April and November 1817 and published the following year. It's thought to be Keats' richest, although most unpolished poem. In the poem, the mortal hero Endymion's quest for the goddess, or the poet's quest for a muse or divine inspiration. In this poem, it's a new shift for Keats, new element. In this poem, actually, he deals with mythology, with myth, with goddess and things like this, and start to concentrate in the poet's quest for a muse or divine inspiration. The poet needs someone to inspire him, to be inspired, to be able to write poetry. And following Endymion, Keats struggled with his assumptions about the power of poetry and philosophy to affect the suffering he saw in life. So, after or following Endymion, Keats struggled with his assumption, his belief that poetry has a power and philosophy to affect the suffering he saw in life from pains and problems and a lot of bad elements in his life. In June of 1818, Keats went on a physically demanding walking tour of England's Lake District and Scotland, perhaps in search of inspiration for an epic poem. After Endymion, he had a tour in England, Lake District and Scotland to be inspired to write more poetry, especially epic poetry. His journey was cut short by the illness of his brother Tom. Keats returned home and nursed his brother through the final stages of tuberculosis. At that time, his brother Tom suffered from tuberculosis, and he cut his journey to Scotland and Lakes District to be beside his brother and nursed him. And when he was in this period, he started to write a very important epic poem called Hyperion. He wrote to a friend to ease himself of Tom's countenance, his voice, and feebleness. He started to deal with writing this poem, epic poem, because by the illness of Tom and the problems he suffered at that time. An epic is a long narrative poem about a worthy hero written in language. This was a principle form used by great poets before Keats. So the epic was used before Keats, but he liked this form and tried to write Hyperion following the same form of the epic writing. So the subject of Hyperion is the fall of the primeval Greek gods who are dethroned by the Olympians, a newer order of gods led by Apollo. So this poem is mainly about Apollo, and he used the myth to represent history as the story of how grief and misery teach humanity compassion. In this epic poem, he liked to teach us a lesson about history, that he is a way of being away from your grief and misery of your own life, and generally to be away from grief and misery of the whole humanity. So Keats used this myth to represent history as the story of how grief and misery teach humanity compassion. The poem ends with the transformation of Apollo into the god of poetry, but Keats left the poem unfinished, and this was his abandonment of the poem suggested that Keats was ready to return to a more personal theme, the growth of the poet's mind. He started to his main character in this poem is called Apollo. This character at the end was totally transformed to a different person, but he couldn't Keats be able to continue writing this poem. This means that the critics mentioned that this is the growth of poet's mind. Keats later described the poem as showing false beauty proceeding from art rather than the true voice of feeling. Tom's death in December 1818 may have freed Keats from the need to finish Hyperion. He didn't like to finish Hyperion, maybe because of the death of his brother Tom. Two other notable developments took place in Keats' life in the later part of 1818. So we have the sonnets, and then the epic, Endymion, and then after this we have first Endymion published in, and then we have a relationship. He started with writing sonnets and then epics, one of the most important epics, Hyperion, and then now he will deal in the latter part of 1818. Two important things happened for him. First, Endymion, published in April, received negative reviews by the leading literary magazines. Second, Keats fell in love with spirited 18-year-old Fanny Brown, and Keats' passion for Brown is perhaps evoked in the Eve of Stygians, written in 1819. So after Hyperion, we have Endymion, and then he fell in love with a girl 18 years old, and for this love, because of this love, he wrote a very important poem that called The Eve of Stygians in 1819. And published in 1820. In this narrative poem, a young man follows an elaborate plan to woo his love and wins her heart. This is the main theme. Main theme of this poem is a love theme. Keats' great creative outpouring came in April and May of 1819 when he composed a group of 5 odes, and this is another stage of his of Keats' poetic life. We started with sonnets, and then epics, and then we have a love poem, and then we have now odes, 5 important odes in his poetic career. The loose formal requirements of the ode, a regular metrical pattern and a shift in perspective from stanza to stanza, allowed Keats to follow his mind's associations. Literary critics rank these works among the greatest short poems in the English language. Each ode began with a speaker focusing on something: a nightingale, an urn, the goddess Psyche, the mood of melancholy, the season of autumn, and arrived at his greater insight into what he values. So we have 5 odes, and they are very important, and you have to know the names, the titles of these odes. In Ode to a Nightingale, the nightingale's song symbolizes the beauty of nature and art. Keats was fascinated by the difference between life and art. Human beings die, but the art they make lives on. The speaker in the poem tries repeatedly to use his imagination to go with the pure song, but each time he fails to completely forget himself. The sixth stanza, he suddenly remembers what death means, and he thought of it frightens him back to earth and his own humanity. So in the first ode to a Nightingale, Keats showed a lot of natural elements and start to compare between life and art, and stress the idea that art lives a lot more than the life itself, and start to mention something about death. In the ode on a Grecian urn, the bride and bridegroom painted on the Grecian urn to not die. Their love can never fade, but neither can they kiss and embrace. At the end of the poem, the speaker sees the wood of art as cold rather than inviting. So in the second ode, Keats tried to continue comparing between life and art and start to stress the idea of love that can never fade. The last two odes, Ode on Melancholy and To Autumn, show a turn in Keats' ideas about life and art. He celebrates breathing human passion as more beautiful than either art or nature. So at the two final odes, Keats tried to sum up all his ideas about life and art. He compares between both of them, but he described that the life of the humanity, the actual life, will be more better than the art described. It's full of a lot of good things, and it's full of life and passion and compassion and true elements. So start to he celebrates breathing human passion as more beautiful than either art or nature. Keats never left to write the poetry of the agonies, the strife of human hearts to which he aspired. Some scholars suggest that his revision of Hyperion, close to the end of his life, measures what he learned about poetry. So in his poetry, he didn't only concentrate on the agonies, on the strife of human hearts, on what he suffered from pains and problems in his own life, but at the same time, it's a way to reflect what his mind tell him about his heart and what he learned about poetry. In the revision, The Fall of Hyperion, a dream, Keats boldly makes the earlier poem into the story of his own quest as a poet. In a dream, the poem's speaker must pass through death to enter a temple that receives only those who cannot forget the miseries of the world. So he tried to write in a dream what the poem's speaker must pass through death to enter a temple that receives only those who cannot forget the miseries of the world, reciting that death is the only solution for finishing the problems of the life. Presiding over the shrine of Minetta. This is the characters of the poem, but the most important thing about the poem that stress the idea of the experience of death and the main importance of death, that we will get rid of our miseries and griefs in life. The knowledge about Keats to be a true poet reflected in this poem, A Dream, to a great extent. After September 1819, Keats produced little poetry because of a lot of money troubles, and at the same time they were very severe and pressing most of the time. Keats and Fanny Brown became engaged, but with little prospect of marriage because of his disease. He suffered from tuberculosis, and he knew that his life would be very short. So he engaged to Brown because he loved her, but at the same time he knew that he would not be able to marry her. In February 1820, Keats had a severe hemorrhage, bleeding, and coughed up blood, beginning a year that he called his posthumous existence. This is posthumous existence. Posthumous means the life after death. He did manage to prepare a third volume of poems for the Brest Lamia, Isabella, The Eve of Stygians, and other poems. So while he suffered from hemorrhage, the main symptom of tuberculosis that cough up blood, he started to collect the volume of his poems. Some poems like Lamia, Isabella, Evo, the Agents, and other poems. And this is the last, I think, the third volume of his poems. In September 1820, Keats sailed to Italy, accompanied by a close friend. The last month of his life there was haunted by the prospect of death and the memory of Fanny Brown. So he was involved at the end of his life by the memory, by the idea, by his love of Brown, just love, spiritual love, not a physical one, that he thought about Brown at the end of his life, and at the same time some prospect of death. So if we concentrate on John Keats, actually we'll find that his life was full of problems and pains. He was most of the time he suffered from disease that was very hard disease, tuberculosis, and this disease actually spent the life of the person very fast, and not only his own life but the life of his mother and all his brothers, three brothers and sister. So, and his father at the same time died because of riding accidents. So his life was full of problems and pains, and they start to use these pains in writing different poems. Like we will sum up them. In the very beginning they are sonnets, and then epics, and then love poems, for love poems, and then start to write different odes, 5 important odes that makes him be aware that while art is very important, life is more important than art, and imagination and passions and affections in truth are better than that in art. But art start to give importance and gives permanence for these emotions. I wish I could do something useful and important, and I wish everyone, if you know something about John Keats, seeing you next video.